Lenin is credited with having created the distinction between correctness and political correctness. That something could be untrue, but still politically correct. Likewise, something could be true, but politically incorrect. At first, many wrote this idea off as mere manipulation of language for party functional purposes. But that alone is more true than at first glance. When you dig down, you hit the real foundation, the formula which all collectivists must surrender their consciences to: power over truth. If you are familiar with the history of the Chernobyl disaster in the former USSR, part of the problem with the disaster is the people in positions of authority would not accept that there was a problem. There was a culture of fear about telling those in power about bad news, and a habit of those in power to punish the messengers. The first inclination that there was an issue did not come from the USSR, who were attempting to cover it up, but instead a nuclear plant in Sweden, keeping track of its own radiation levels. To sample for possible leaks, found nothing wrong with their own equipment despite a massive spike in detected radiation. Soon after, it was proven to be from Chernobyl. This lack of notice by the Soviet authorities to others around the world resulted in health problems in many places, leading to birth defects. In an attempt to secure their power against the horrible truth which the Soviets felt could threaten their power, they ended up losing large amounts of credibility, not only outside the USSR, but from within as well. The slow march towards system collapse only became more accelerated due to this, though it appears that the essential dissolution of the USSR was inevitable, for every falsehood spoken is a liability towards the truth, and at some point that obligation becomes untenable and must be repaid. We can see this across all collectivist systems. Under the tyranny of Nazi Germany, people dared not to speak the truth of their defeats to der Führer. The lie of productivity in their factories, the destruction of their factories, the fact that although Nazi Germany could produce 60 Tiger 6s every week, the Soviet factories could pump out 3,600 T-34s. It may not have mattered, but truth became secondary. Fascism failed, for many reasons of course, but making truth a secondary concern added to the inertia of the fall. So now we move on to China. The Chinese Communist Party specifically. They have been touted often as being a different kind of collectivism, a more functional and modern version of the Marxist or Hegelian version. The results essentially speak for themselves. China has been a massive economic success story only relatively recently. There is a lot to be said of China. There is a lot of good to be said of China. But is that due to the actions or plans of why have you of the Chinese Communist Party? This may be a controversial statement, but I'm going to say definitively no. The reality is that although the Chinese government decided to open their economy to foreign investment, you could not attest the economic success of China to the Chinese government. For it was by their own acts which caused the previous era of relative economic stagnation. No, it must and necessarily be attested to the private capital which flooded into China from foreign lands. Wealth that was created only through the efficiency of the free market. For our purposes, we will use free, even though free markets aren't completely free. So who and what was responsible? Capitalism and the capitalists. In as much as China succeeded, it was not due to the Communist Party, but perhaps the Chinese people energized by capitalist investment. To say as such would be considered unholy blasphemy to the Communist Party, inasmuch as you could call the Communist Party in China successful, is in that they oppress and control their population with violence. I, however, do not regard that as success, but rather failure. China, under its Communist Party government, suffers from the exact problem with power being more important than truth. During the Wuhan coronavirus crisis, the government in China chose not to act, suppressed the whistleblowers, and ignored the experts on the ground who were warning the state regarding the severity and seriousness of the illness. The now famous whistleblower ophthalmologist Li Wenliang, who was punished for all his attempts to warn others, has himself succumbed to the effects of the virus. We all as humans recognize that as tragic. This is just one example probably amongst dozens or hundreds of others which haven't leaked out of the censorious regime. What are the actual numbers within China? Why didn't they warn everyone else of the size and scale of the problem? Thousands of lives lost due to this mistake. The entire world economy on standby. Millions laid off from their jobs in a heroic effort to not let this Chinese virus decimate us. They now claim to have a handle on their domestic problem and are sending supplies around the world to other affected countries. This seems generous, kind even. The real tragedy being that it was all avoidable had China taken seriously the disease when the experts sent out warnings rather than try to cover up the issue. In other words, they traded truth for power. Reality, however, does not care for its manipulation, and so no amount of purposeful ignorance could overcome it. This should be obvious to all. China allowed the virus to spread out of control. This was China's Chernobyl, except worse. Only it is as if they had allowed the reactors to blow up. As much as we can criticize the USSR and other collectivist regimes, the USSR did not allow the reactors in the Chernobyl disaster to explode. They may not have told everyone, even their own citizens, immediately, but eventually they admitted reality. They succumbed to the truth. The Chinese Communist Party still has not taken responsibility for the scale of the disaster. They are actively attempting to blame other people, including the US military. If COVID-19 is referred to as the China coronavirus, calls of racism can be heard throughout the land, aided by the many gullible journalists educated in many postmodernist courses which, lo behold, emphasize power over truth. The Chinese government is not competent enough to be trusted with anything important if they cannot be trusted to do something so simple as warn the world of an impending pandemic. The CCP has failed not only the hard-working, industrious, and time-honored Chinese people, but the world. Why should we continue to associate with such a government? Every day that we do not decouple from China is another day that the good Chinese people remain enslaved by the Communist Party. We can encourage them to change, to support freedoms and liberty, but we will have to stop doing business with them if we want a clear conscience. The coronavirus pandemic is a good example of the failures of postmodernist collectivist thinking. It demonstrates to us that no matter how much power you seek, it can be destroyed completely with just a little bit of truth, and it will strike back with compound interest.